The Denver Broncos have traded star pass rusher Bradley Chubb to the Miami Dolphins in exchange for a 2023 first-round pick. How does this trade impact the Denver Broncos defensively at the edge rusher position from a draft standpoint? Not to mention, Denver went out and they acquired a pass rusher themselves, plus they got somebody else in exchange for the Bradley Chubb trade as well from the Miami Dolphins. We break that down and much more in today's brand new breaking news episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, everybody? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format, or whether you're watching us on YouTube. Do us all a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button down below so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. We have a very, very special breaking news episode here for you on Locked on Broncos, from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, Sayre, Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. The Broncos have done it. They have made a move at the NFL trade deadline, sending star pass rusher Bradley Chubb to the Miami Dolphins, pairing him alongside Emmanuel Ogbah and Jalen Phillips. But in return, the Denver Broncos, they'll be getting a first-round pick in the 2023 NFL draft that didn't necessarily belong to the Dolphins, more so came from the 49ers, but they also received a player in return plus a future draft pick. I mean, Sayre, you and I have talked about this. The compensation, I think, had to be right if the Broncos were going to deal away Bradley Chubb. And look, George Paton, and as many people in Broncos country wanted, they got a first-round pick back.
That's right, and that first-round pick is coming from the Miami Dolphins, Cody, but it comes from all the way back at the 2021 NFL Draft. Remember when the Miami Dolphins, back then, they held the number 3 overall pick. They traded that pick to the San Francisco 49ers, who traded multiple first-round picks to get Trey Lance. So this is part of what the Dolphins received in the Trey Lance trade, because Miami's own first-round pick was taken away after all these, NFL investigating their involvement in trying to recruit Sean Payton and Tom Brady and that whole bizarre story that came out. So this pick is coming from the San Francisco 49ers. So anybody that's looking to see, hey, where are the Broncos going to be picking now in the first round of the 2023 NFL draft, just watch where the San Francisco 49ers finish. Obviously, they're coming off a very impressive win. You and I, Cody, were talking before we started recording today that maybe, you were talking maybe late first round for that 49ers pick. I think that's definitely within the realm of possibility, right? I mean, 2 out of the last 3 years, they've finished in the NFL's Final Four. So it's not out of question for the Broncos to be getting a late first round pick in this situation. But right now, the 49ers are 4-4. They just picked up Christian McCaffrey at the trade deadline. The Broncos at this point, they're projected to be picking in the middle of round 1, but it really could be anywhere from, like 15 all the way down into the bottom half of that first round. So right now, Tankathon has them at 20th. The 49ers would be a playoff team if the season ended today, as crazy as that seems at 4-4. But man, Cody, a lot to digest with this. Of course, first and foremost, Bradley Chubb is leaving the Denver Broncos. They're getting a first-round pick. We have no idea who that's going to be or what kind of impact that player is going to make eventually, or what that pick is even going to be used for in the future. But as of right now, the biggest part of this story is the departure of Bradley Chubb from a top 5 defense, one of the best pass rush units in the NFL, and a pass rush unit that's missing a couple of key guys to injury heading into the bye week.
Well, and let's talk about that right here, because we'll talk about the newest addition that the Broncos got at the pass rusher position here in a little bit. And obviously on tomorrow's episode, Locked on Broncos, we're really going to dive deep into the optics of this potential first-round pick that the Broncos will have in a 2023 NFL draft. That'll be on tomorrow's episode show, but kind of talk about really just the impact, the void that is left now by Bradley Chubb's departure. I mean, you said it best right there. The Broncos right now are dealing with some injuries. We heard from Nathaniel Hackett on Tuesday prior to the NFL trade deadline, and he said he was asked a question about Randy Gregory, Baron Browning, their status. We know Randy Gregory had knee surgery, was on short-term IR, and then Baron Browning, we know, had the hip injury. The hip flexor was weak, is going to be several weeks. who knows what that means for their status against the Tennessee Titans. I mean, they have the bye week this week, and then next week they'll be back in preparation for their matchup in Nashville there. So we'll see. But if not, like the Broncos could be going into Tennessee in just about a week and a half, 2 weeks time here, and they could be doing it with Nick Bonito and Jonathan Cooper as their starting pass rushers in this game, and the new addition, that we'll talk about here in a little bit alongside Jonathan Kongbo. But, I think it's a big void. Obviously, various Broncos players, Justin Simmons, Draymond Jones, they love Bradley Chubb. They went to social media and expressed how much that they cared about him. Draymond even went to the extent saying this one hurts because we all know that the NFL is a business, but man, he said this one really hurts. And those two guys, they were just celebrating a sack on Sunday against the Jaguars with a cup of tea in the middle of the field at Wimbledon Stadium. So that definitely impacts things. But in terms of the rotation right now with the injuries, it definitely leaves a lot of questions. Can the Broncos get through that? I mean, yes, you're going to have a first-round pick. You're also going to have a fourth-round pick. But can you get through a couple weeks potentially if you don't have Baron Browning or Randy Gregory? That is a huge question here left by the trade here of Bradley Chubb.
It is a huge question, and I think it's one that the Broncos tried desperately to answer like 6-7 months ago, right? They tried to go out, they tried to get Randy Gregory in free agency. You move Baron Browning to the edge position, and you draft Nick Bonito with your top pick. It's really something that's kind of felt like it's been in the works for a while, and you and I had even talked about it way back when, Cody, when the Broncos made all those moves, talking about what is the long-term outlook for this position? Like, if best case scenario happens with guys like Baron Browning, if it works out, which to this point, I think we can clearly see it has. And if Nick Bonito is a hit as a draft pick, what is the best case scenario? Well, I think we're kind of living it, right? In terms of just the fact that those guys have played really well. Randy Gregory looks like when he's been healthy, he's been a premier free agent signing, a very, very good player for the Broncos. So really, you're still 4 deep at this position. And then you trade for another guy we're going to talk about here coming up, but you trade for another guy in Jacob Martin and bring in Chase Edmonds in this trade as well. It's a really loaded situation for the Broncos, right? Because it's not like they couldn't afford Bradley Chubb. Remember, it had been reported multiple times. If the Broncos didn't trade Chubb, they were going to try to find a way to get a long-term deal done. This was really, to me, just about the fact, like we talked in a previous episode, and I think this is important to remember, the Broncos realize that right now they have some needs for starters in 2023 at other positions that they may or may not be confident that they can get a top tier free agent, right? Because we know the Broncos are going to go out and be active in free agency. So that will wash out, number one, any compensatory draft picks for Bradley Chubb in the future. But number two, if you're not confident that you can get a top tier player at a position of need in free agency, you have to protect yourself with draft picks, and the Broncos didn't have any. So this was a way for them to say, hey, we believe in Randy Gregory, Baron Browning, Nick Bonito, Jonathan Cooper. We believe in that rotation, but we also understand we have other ways that we need to better surround Russell Wilson going forward. I think that's the justification for this move, at least from the way that I see it, Cody. Doesn't mean we like it, right? We all love Bradley Chubb. At least I know you and I love Bradley Chubb, and a number of the people that listen and comment and jump in the mentions, they love Bradley Chubb, and we get it. Bradley Chubb he was a top 5 pick, somebody we believed could be a superstar defensive player for the Broncos. He was finally starting to stay healthy this season and show why the Broncos drafted him so high. Now we got to, kind of root for him a little bit in Miami while also kind of just keeping one eye on the future.
And I think that's an important thing, right? Because I think as we've often at times covering this business, you see it, right? You develop relationships with players. And like I took to Twitter, right? Bradley Chubb has always been great to me. There's times where we just talk about life. We don't just talk about football. I'll go up to him to his locker and he'll just, hey, what'd you do this weekend? Stuff like that. Like Chubb was always first class with us in the media. So wishing him the best in Miami. The Broncos will now move forward with Baron Browning, Randy Gregory, Jonathan Cooper, Jacob Martin, and Jonathan Kongbo as it currently stands right now. And so what are the Broncos getting exactly with Jacob Martin, who's coming over from the New York Jets? Sayre and I, we're going to dive a little bit deeper to that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about Prize Picks, the sponsor of today's breaking news podcast episode of Lockdown Broncos. And Prize Picks is daily fantasy sports done right. And with the Prize Picks app, you choose 2 to 5 players that you're focused on heading into the week. And these players will have a projection that's set by Prize Picks. And you simply choose whether or not they will have more or less than their Prize Picks projection, which could allow you to win 10 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. So download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, Prize Picks will give you $50. Don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. All right, Sayre, as we continue on today's breaking news episode of Locked On Broncos, the Broncos have dealt away star pass rusher Bradley Chubb to the Miami Dolphins in exchange for draft capital, plus a player. But the Broncos, they weren't done making moves just yet. They also made a trade for another pass rusher. Thank you so much, Broncos country, for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, whether you're watching us on YouTube. If you're watching us on YouTube, do us a quick favor, hit that like button on the video, comment for the algorithm, share your thoughts on the Bradley Chubb trade as well. Get involved in the conversation here. So let's talk about Jacob Martin. The Broncos, they weren't done. After the Bradley Chubb trade, they went and they acquired New York Jets pass rusher Jacob Martin to add as a depth move. Now, Ian Rappaport worded it kind of funny because he mentioned to fill the void left by Bradley Chubb. I don't know necessarily he was brought in to fill the void left by Bradley Chubb, but more so as a depth option for this team, because when you look at his time with the New York Jets, he played only 28% of their defensive snaps. So he's kind of in a rotational role for them in bits and pieces throughout the season. But he did play 54% of their special team snaps, which goes to the point which you quote tweeted at Ian Rappaport and said to fill the void left by Aaron Patrick, who suffered a torn ACL just several weeks ago. And this is more than likely the move that Denver is going, adding another pass rusher there, because as it stands right now, we've talked about Baron Browning's injury, Randy Gregory, you have Jonathan Cooper, Nick Bonito, Jonathan Kongbo, who's a practice squad elevation, but you needed another guy, and that guy is simply Jacob Martin at this point, who could be asked to step in and play a defensive role as well against the Tennessee Titans, considering the injury status of Baron Browning and Randy Gregory.
That's right. And he was one time a part of a big trade between the Seattle Seahawks and the Houston Texans. If memory serves me correctly, Cody, Jacob Martin made a name for himself initially with Seattle on special teams, played in a rotational role and on special teams for the Houston Texans for a few years before going over to the New York Jets. So really, this is a move for depth. I mean, it's certainly not to replace Bradley Chubb. We talked about it. That's what the Broncos had planned on with guys like Randy Gregory, Baron Browning, Nick Bonito, and even Jonathan Cooper. Those are going to be the guys playing the primary role in the rotation off the edge. So really, this is an upgrade on special teams. I think it maybe speaks to the fact that the Broncos have given Jonathan Kongbo a bit of an audition these last couple weeks to kind of show himself, prove himself, and they went with somebody that has a bit more experience in the NFL. And look, I think you can look at this as a way to say, I mean, the Broncos are still trying to be in this thing, Cody. I think that's a narrative that maybe we'll talk about more at length another time. But I think that just the fact you go and get Jacob Martin, you go and make a move like, remember last year, the Broncos traded for Jonas Griffith, and everybody thought, well, that's just a move to upgrade special teams. And he's turned out to be a pretty darn good player. Or even the Alex Singleton signing more recently, where everyone like me was saying, hey, that's a special teams move. No, actually, he's ended up being a really big part of the defense. So I think that could be a situation that we're looking at here. Maybe Jacob Martin is somebody that we expect to be more part of special teams, but he ends up as part of the rotation. We've seen injuries happen. I mean, he coming out of the bye week against Tennessee, maybe he does play a pretty significant role. But going forward, a depth option, somebody the Broncos are going to rely on special teams. Dwayne Stukes has obviously had to deal with a lot of injuries to his unit this season. So it's good for him to be able to get somebody with experience, somebody that he knows, and he will know that he can rely on every given week to do their job well in that phase of the game. Because remember, the Broncos going into this season, they've been so bad on special teams. I would like to say, just point out that unit has taken a huge leap in the right direction this year, in my opinion. But just in terms of what the Broncos had to give up to get him, roughly the price of a 5th round pick, all things told, they moved down from the 4th round to the 5th round in 2024. That's on the trade value chart. If you look at that and refer to that, it's roughly the value of a 5th round pick. So something that the Broncos obviously feel like they needed to make a move to upgrade their depth with Aaron Patrick, who was a key piece of this team that not really a lot of people talked about.
Well, and I'm glad that you mentioned it as well, right? Because it's just another instance of George Paton, you're right, trading for a player, but also receiving a draft pick in return. So it kind of really offsets. It's like offsetting penalties when you acquire a guy like Jacob Martin, plus you get the deal there. And I think also another thing too, just I think for me, looking at this whole entire trade deadline for the Broncos, look, it was a wild trade deadline all across the NFL. Various players moving, some surprising compensation offset. And look, you can check out Locked On NFL, and you can check out Locked On Sports Today by Peter Bukowski and your favorite podcast providers to get a little more insight on the full wide scope of the NFL trade deadline here. But I think ideally, it just goes to show George Paton loves his draft picks. He loves being able to acquire additionals, even if it's a late 5th, late 6th round pick. But surprisingly enough, we did not see any other trade movement from the Broncos. We didn't see Albert O offset. We didn't see Melvin Gordon, Dalton Risner, some of the other guys whose names have been potentially linked to some trade rumors. We didn't see them offset one bit. So part of me is wondering, how does that impact things going forward? But not to mention, the Broncos, they also acquired a running back from the Miami Dolphins in the Bradley Chubb trade. What does Chase Edmonds offer to the Broncos running back room both this season and maybe in the future? That's something that Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we're going to dive deep into coming up here in just a moment on today's breaking news podcast here, Locked On Broncos. But before we do that, let me tell you about BetOnline.net, the sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. BetOnline.net is your number one source for betting football and the start of the new basketball season here this year. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth analysis on every single game. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport that's out there. They're the fastest and the easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. As the Denver Broncos offset Bradley Chubb in a trade to the Miami Dolphins, the Broncos have also received a running back in return. What type of impact could Chase Edmonds have on this Broncos team? Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in to today's emergency podcast. We've covered every single day, all year long, all things Denver Broncos here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. Thanks for making us your first listen. Sayre, Chase Edmonds is now a member of the Denver Broncos, and I think it's safe to say when you look at the Broncos roster right now, with all the running backs they have on the 53, the Broncos have a stable of running backs.
They really do, Cody. I mean, it's something else. I all that's gone on in the last couple of days, I had to go look it up. Who's the running back the Broncos just brought in before this? I mean, I forgot Marlon Mack was on the team. Man, it's really kind of cool actually to see. I mean, as the trade deadline has passed now, I mean, we've been kind of watching as we're recording this episode because you never know when things are going to leak after the deadline. But man, Melvin Gordon, Chase Edmonds, I mean, Latavius Murray, Marlon Mack, even Divine Ozigbo. The Broncos have all these guys on the active roster at this point. So it's going to be really interesting to see what the fallout is. Like, is there going to be somebody released? Is somebody going to, be upset about the fact? Or, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. All I know is that the Broncos definitely knew after the Javonte Williams injury, they needed to make something happen for 2023 because, like you mentioned, these contracts are expiring. But Chase Edmonds, he's under contract for next year. He's under contract for 2023. So right now, the Broncos will be able to go into next offseason knowing that they have somebody that could maybe shoulder the majority of the load. I know that a lot of Dolphins fans weren't exactly sad to see Chase Edmonds go. It didn't really work out for him there in Miami this season, but certainly somebody who's proven he could be an effective third down back and catch a lot of passes for you. So I'll be interested to see how the Broncos utilize him, how they get him involved. Why they had him included in this Bradley Chubb trade could be more financially motivated on Miami's side than really necessarily something the Broncos required to get Bradley Chubb. So if anybody's out there kind of thinking, well, the Broncos could have got way better value for Bradley Chubb if they wouldn't have had Chase Edmonds included in the trade, I don't think that's the case, Cody, because here's something key. Bradley Chubb cost $7 million against the salary cap for the remainder of this season. and the Miami Dolphins had less than $6 million in salary cap space. So by trading Chase Edmonds, you free up a little bit of that space this year and get that wiggle room to be able to add Bradley Chubb to your roster and work on a long-term deal without being, in the negative on the salary cap. So there's definitely a lot of layered things here, but I think it helps the Broncos with the Javonte Williams injury to be able to say, all right, we can kind of, go to sleep at night knowing that we have somebody with NFL experience that's going to be on the roster going into next year.
Well, and I think a lot of people, too, Broncos fans, are looking at the statistical production of a guy like Chase Edmonds in Miami this year and like, hey, what's going on with him? Like, Raheem Mostert is obviously the primary back down there. Not to mention they air it out to Tua and Jalen Waddle quite a bit there. So for him, I think when you look at the stats, it doesn't look like a very productive season for Chase Edmonds in Miami, right? Because he only has 42 carries on the year for 120 yards, which only equates to 2.9 yards per carry at this point. And so I think this is more so of a deal like, okay, you help Miami take maybe another salary off the books, but also I think the Broncos internally believe it's about potential, right? It's not necessarily about trading for a guy like Edmonds because of what he's done, because quite frankly, he hasn't really done anything this year, but it's what he can do. It's what he can become. And I think that's something that the Broncos pro personnel department, pro scouting, George Paton, I think they understand these things as well. And you make the interesting kind of narrative there. Like Javonte Williams, who knows if he's going to be ready for the start of the season next year for the Broncos, right? Because of the significant knee injury that he did sustain. So Denver does have some options there. Not to mention, I mean, we could see a little bit of a dynamic trio in 2024 for this Broncos football team, or 2023, however, wherever we're at here. And it could be Javonte Williams, Chase Edmonds. It could even be Damarius Crockett, who was anticipated originally for tearing his ACL to have a big role and maybe being the number 3 running back for this Broncos team. But if Latavius Murray keeps playing well, Sayre, I mean, is it a stretch to say that, hey, maybe Latavius steps into that role as that third running back option for the Broncos? And Mike Boone, we've seen how valuable he is on special teams. Does that change anything with maybe what the Broncos plan to do this offseason? Because these guys aren't going to command big deals themselves.
Right, exactly. It's going to be kind of another committee, another by committee approach. I think even when you look at free agency, there's a lot of guys out there and teams just don't really seem to be wanting or willing to pay top dollar for running backs these days. I think the Broncos, I wouldn't be surprised, Cody, I don't know this off the top of my head. I wouldn't be surprised if the deal the Broncos signed Melvin Gordon to is one of the richer running back deals that we've seen signed in the last 3-4 years, just because, I mean, running backs, they're just not getting paid a ton of money these days. And he got $9 million a year or something like that back in 2020. So it'll be fascinating to see what they do. Maybe a guy like Latavius Murray does play his way into another contract with the team, just another 1-year deal, nothing crazy, but maybe even Melvin Gordon. Shoot, I mean, it's been how many games since he fumbled? So I think, and obviously he contributed to the win against the Jaguars on Sunday. So you never know. I mean, you just never know what's going to happen. I think the Broncos understand maybe they need some new blood there. I don't think they're going to do anything that will prevent them from attacking the running back position in the 2023 NFL draft. And we'll talk about that in our upcoming episode about the draft implications. But I think that's going to be an area with the Javonte Williams injury that you got to be cognizant of going into next season. Now you got Chase Edmonds in the fold. You could easily bring back Latavius Murray. I think you've set yourself up to go with a budget-friendly approach at that position, which I think is kind of what everybody in Broncos country loves, right?
Well, hey, maybe what's Denver going to do with that first-round pick is going to be a huge question. Not to mention, will the Broncos address the offensive line in free agency? I mean, I think ideally after this trade, I mean, Denver's sitting in a pretty good position, right? I mean, ideally you would have liked to have Bradley Chubb, one of your core guys. The Broncos lose a captain, which also begs the question, are the Broncos going to give a captain patch out to somebody else now that Chubb is no longer on the team? That's another question. But one thing that Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we're going to do on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos, we're going to dive into the first-round pick. What position becomes a priority? What could the Broncos look at? A really, really, really early look ahead at the 2023 first-round pick that the Broncos acquired, and also how it stands with the placement for how San Francisco finishes this season. Not to mention, we're also going to dive into the fact that the Broncos are not rebuilding, folks. Why are we seeing so many takes on social media about this trade signifies a rebuild? It does not. We're going to provide some more context to that on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.